With the first several topics in this course, we are laying our foundation for a detailed examination of issues of social stratification based on race, ethnicity, class, gender, and sexual orientation. You already have a general understanding of what is meant by the term social stratification and a more in-depth understanding of how sociologists engage the sociological imagination when examining social inequality. There's a clear need to understand both the individual level experiences of power and oppression, as well as the larger social and historical context in which this occurs, to understand the interplay between individual choice and larger opportunity structures. With this in mind, we will now focus on the concept of intersectionality, the idea that all of us experience different combinations of privilege and marginalization depending on our social location within society and within our immediate social context. While we'll be covering gender, sexual orientation, and so on one at a time during much of the semester, we first need to understand how these different systems of inequality combine together within each person's lived experiences. Let's get started. A key characteristic of sociology is that sociologists work to give voice to the people who are marginalized in our society. If a group is marginalized, that means that it occupies a position outside the centers of power within a given society. This idea of giving voice comes from the work of Ida B. Wells Barnett and Anna Julia Cooper, two important theorists, researchers, and activists who laid important groundwork for the sociology of gender and race, as well as the concept of intersectionality. We'll see more of their work later in the semester, but for now, I want to highlight the fact that they argued that it is the duty of the analyst to privilege the least heard voices. This is why I have you reading the books and articles and listening to the podcasts or watching the videos that I've assigned. Many of them are stories about people who are often set aside and overlooked in our society. Most people will never come across or pay attention to these stories, and while their lives might not be representative of an entire group of people, they do give us important things to think about regarding the personal impact of stratification in our society. So, sociologists attempt to give voice to those who have been silenced. But what's particularly amazing about giving voice to the silenced is that the marginalized usually have incredible insights into our society that the privileged don't because of their privileged status. Because they are excluded from positions of power, marginalized groups typically have a clearer view of how power operates, for example. The marginalized can observe power dynamics from the outside, and for that reason, never take those dynamics for granted. As a result, the marginalized develop what sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois called double consciousness. We'll see a lot more of Du Bois later in the semester as well, but for now, the concept of double consciousness is central to his investigation of race and marginalization in general. This is where the marginalized have a consciousness arising out of two, at times, contradictory perspectives. First, there is the consciousness arising out of one's marginalized identity and experience. And second, there's the consciousness arising out of the internalized cultural images of the dominant group. Again, what's particularly important about this characteristic of sociology is that the marginalized usually have incredible insights into our society that the rest of us don't have because of our privileged status. For example, marginalized groups typically have a clearer view of how power operates because they observe it from the outside. In very important ways, those who are marginalized essentially live in two worlds and have to understand both. For example, a Latinx person living in our society will grow up immersed in and learning all about their own culture. But in order to survive and ideally thrive in a world dominated by white people, they also have to learn about white culture its values, norms, and even its ways of thinking. In contrast, this white person over here doesn't have to learn anything about his Latinx culture. They don't have to learn about its distinctive values, norms, and ways of thinking. In fact, they could live their life without ever having to directly interact with a Latinx person. So they only live in their own white world, while he doesn't have a choice but to inhabit their world. Because they're immersed in their own white world, they don't have to think about how it operates. It's all second nature to them. So they have the luxury of being able to take it for granted. But he doesn't have that privilege. He is constantly aware of how the dominant white world operates because he has to know it well enough to be able to survive within it. However, because they can take their world for granted, they are likely to be oblivious to the inner workings of how it operates, such as how power works, and the fact that they have it and use it even when they're not aware of it. On the other hand, he is very much aware of the power dynamics within society and how they operate. He can see it because he has to in order to get by. It's immediately apparent to him, and he's always aware of it. Basically, this means that the marginalized inhabit two worlds simultaneously, double consciousness. So by listening to the voice of the marginalized, sociologists open themselves to seeing society from a whole variety of perspectives, giving us a much more complete and nuanced understanding of how the world works, particularly with regard to the dynamics of power. Feminist theorists, like sociologist Dorothy Smith, emphasize the relevance of one's social location in society for how one perceives and experiences the world, and social inequality in particular. The concept they use is standpoint epistemology. Epistemology is a theory of knowledge. So standpoint epistemology means that one's knowledge of the world is dependent on one's position or standpoint within society. For example, from the standpoint of the privileged, the practices and systems of privilege are invisible. So if you truly want to understand privilege, it's necessary to examine it from the standpoint of those who are outside of the privileged system. Echoing the work of Wells, Barnett, and Cooper, Smith goes on to argue that we must therefore center these marginalized voices in order to truly understand privilege, oppression, and domination. This concept of standpoint epistemology also implies that there are more than just two standpoints, the privileged and the marginalized. There are, in fact, many different standpoints that must be taken into account. Much of this semester, we'll be looking at race, class, gender, and sexuality by themselves, one at a time. This helps us to understand the dynamics of oppression for each one, but obviously the real world isn't as simple as that. When we focus on a person's race as if they had no class, gender, or sexuality, it makes analyzing race much easier. But in the real world, people, their experiences, and the nature of oppression and stratification are all much more complicated. We all have races, classes, genders, and sexualities all mixed together. And what's even more important is that depending on what kind of combination of these you have, you can be more or less marginalized and oppressed as a result. This idea is captured in the concept of the matrix of privilege and oppression, which also comes from the work of Wells, Barnett, and Cooper. What this means is that race, class, gender, sexual orientation, and so on intersect in individual lives and societal configurations. This matrix both privileges and oppresses people to greater or lesser degrees depending on where they fall within it. Now, I'm a visual person, so this is my representation of how it works. Think of the center of this diagram, the place where the two axes intersect, as the center of power and privilege in society. Then, as you move further and further away from that center, you are more and more marginalized within that society. Okay, now let's look at a particular example. Here is a person who is cisgender, Latina, poor, and lesbian. When you plot all of these points on the graph and then connect them, you can see that she is pretty spread out and overall is far from the center, though further in some areas than in others. She is clearly marginalized in our society, but this doesn't mean you'll never get ahead in our society, but it does mean you'll face more hurdles and have to work especially hard to overcome them if you hope to succeed. In terms of this matrix, it's like she has 4 strikes against her, and in many parts of our society, and unlike baseball, all you need is 1 strike before you're out of the game entirely. So just imagine having multiple strikes against you, as this woman does. On the other hand, if you are a white, upper-class, straight man, things are more likely going to work out in your favor. Not that they will, but you have more resources and opportunities to draw upon than those who are marginalized. So the particular combination of these variables you have affects your experience of marginalization, oppression, and privilege in our society. And it also gives you a very different perspective on the world and how it works, because your standpoint is fundamentally shaped by your place within this matrix. Clearly, this man and woman will have very different standpoints on how the world works. And unless he's had a lot of sociological training, engaged in much personal reflection, and or learned from the unique insights of the marginalized and the oppressed, he's likely to have a much more narrow view on issues of inequality and how the world works compared to this hypothetical Latina. So, as we proceed into the semester, it's extremely important to keep in mind that privilege and marginalization are not either-or things. That assumption rests on a system of dualistic thinking that we'll spend much of the term critiquing. Thinking in dualistic terms, male, female, straight, gay, black, white, marginalized or privileged, certainly makes the world a lot less complicated for us. But just like everything else, such a dualistic view of privilege and marginality is inaccurate because it's too simplistic. One's experience of marginality and privilege varies a lot depending upon the particular combination of social boundaries within the individual. So not all white people are equally privileged, and not all Native Americans, women, queer people, or poor people are equally marginalized. There are important variations of experience even within both the most privileged and the most marginalized groups, which means that there are many, many different possible standpoints out there as well. Remember what we learned about diversity within the group on the first day of class. When you look at the scientific data, you realize that whether you're speaking biologically or socially, there are more variations within a group than there are differences between different groups. This is true of privilege and marginalization as well. So, both marginalization and privilege are a matter of degree. Just to make things even more complicated, your experience of privilege and marginalization, your social standpoint, changes as you move from one social environment to another. For example, if you are a woman and you're in an environment where everyone is a woman, then that source of marginalization is likely to fall into the background, and other variables like race, language, sexual orientation, citizenship status, and class move into the foreground. But when this same woman enters an environment dominated by men, the gender comes right back into the foreground. What all of this tells us is that understanding people's experiences of privilege and marginalization are all highly complicated. But the concepts of double consciousness, intersectionality, standpoint, and the matrix all help us grapple with that complexity and understand its implications for social stratification.